The auction yard reeked of rust, oil, and something sour, perhaps despair, perhaps old blood. The sound of chains dragging against metal grates filled the air, interrupted only by the occasional shout or guttural bark of a sail. No sunlight reached this place, only the harsh flicker of overhead halogens and the glow of neon pricing displays hovering above each cage. Among the many beings huddled in filth, one stood out, not because she begged, not because she fought, but because she didn't react at all. She didn't flinch when a guard kicked the bars near her. Didn't look up when the auctioneer mocked her with that usual joke about defective merchandise. Just sat still, bound at the wrists and ankles with oxidized iron bands that hummed faintly with stun charges. Her skin had once been a shade of soft, shifting violet, now dulled to a sickly gray. One horn had been snapped near the base. A scar carved down her cheek like a reminder of her last attempt to resist. Her eyes weren't dead, they were worse than dead. They were hollow. Bidding had gone quiet. No one wanted her. Too broken. Too silent. Not entertaining enough. Even the cruel ones, the ones who bought bodies for games, had passed her over. The auctioneer grunted and reset the starting price from 300 credits to 100, then 50, then 20. That's when the human stepped forward. He was tall, wrapped in a long, weathered coat that barely hid the thick frame beneath. Graying hair, unshaven face, and a cold stare that didn't scan or leer. He just looked. The crowd shifted, murmured. Humans were rare here. One of the guards scoffed, but the man didn't respond. He simply walked up to the auction terminal, tapped in a bid 15 credits. A joke, surely. A scrap bid for a scrap being. Except no one else countered. The terminal flashed green. Sale confirmed. A mechanical voice read out the transfer of ownership, while the guard unlocked the cage. She didn't move. Not even when the collar hissed and released. The human didn't touch her. He didn't need to. He just looked at her and said, "Come on." She stood, hesitated, then followed. He led her through the back alleys of the outpost. No words. No chains. He didn't guide her by force, didn't shove or drag. He just walked, slow and sure. She trailed him, limping slightly from an old injury that hadn't healed right. She kept waiting for the twist, for the moment the kindness would shatter and reveal the cruelty beneath. That's how it always worked. That's how they trained her to think. Hope was a weapon used to soften the blow. They reached a small transport module dock near the fringe gates. Standard issue, patched and old, but functional. He gestured for her to step inside. She did. Still silent. He gave her a blanket. Not fresh, not new, but clean and warm. She held it like she'd never touched softness before. As the ship lifted, he finally spoke again. "You have a name?" She didn't answer. "I'll call you Leary," he said. Not a question. Not a command. Just a statement. She stared at him. Her language had been beaten out of her long ago. Her identity replaced by a number. Names were forbidden among the chained. A name meant memory. A name meant soul. Leary. It didn't hurt to hear it. He flew in silence, fingers steady on the controls. No music. No chatter. Just quiet hums from the engine and the occasional click of a switch. She watched him. He was scarred, inside and out. Something about the way he carried himself, measured, tired, like a man who had seen too much and spoken too little. His eyes didn't avoid hers. They didn't pierce either. They just saw. The ship landed at a small outpost far from the main trade lines. Snow dusted the ground outside. As the hatch opened, a blast of cold hit her, but the human handed her a thick coat. She hesitated before putting it on. Still no chains. Still no beatings. She didn't understand. The cabin was simple. A fire in a metal stove, stacks of supplies along the walls, a single cot, a second bedroll lay near it. He motioned to the roll. "It's yours," he said. She sat, waiting for instructions. He took off his coat, poured water into a kettle, and set it over the fire. She flinched as he approached, but all he did was offer her a steaming mug a few minutes later. She sniffed. It smelled sweet, earthy. She sipped. It burned a little, but not in a bad way. He didn't talk much that night. Just sat across from her, sipping his own drink, staring at the fire. The silence wasn't threatening. It was peaceful. Still, her muscles remained tense. Sleep didn't come. At some point in the night, she heard him breathing steadily. Asleep. Vulnerable. She stood, walked quietly to the door. It wasn't locked. No alarms. No guards. Freedom, right there. But her feet didn't move. The floor was warm under her. The fire crackled gently. Her blanket smelled of pinewood and dust. She sat back down. The next morning, he cooked something. Flatbread, protein packs, eggs maybe. She watched him place a plate near her without a word. She didn't touch it. He didn't push. Just nodded and started eating his own. Time passed. Hours? Days? She couldn't track it. The scars across her arms itched less. Her eyes blinked more often, adjusting to light, to warmth. He showed her how to light the stove, where the storage locker was, how to make tea. She mimicked slowly. Still no questions. Still no pain. On the fourth night, she whispered, "Why me?" He didn't look at her. Just stirred the pot gently. "I saw someone once," he said finally. "After a battle. She was hurt. I didn't help. Walked away. Couldn't face it. You looked just like her." A pause. "I can't change the past. But I can pay the debt." She wanted to believe him. That his kindness had no hidden end. And in that moment, as she drank the tea he made and watched snow fall beyond the window, something cracked. Just a little. Not enough to trust. But enough to feel. Enough to remember that she once had a name. Maybe Leary wasn't hers. But it felt better than being no one. The first time she laughed, it startled them both. It was a quiet sound, almost choked, more like a breath catching in the throat than joy released. But it was there, real, unforced. He'd made a passing comment about the old heater's groaning noises sounding like a dying walrus. She didn't know what a walrus was, but the way he said it, with a strange mix of deadpan and weariness, pulled something loose in her chest. The sound escaped her before she could stop it, and for a split second, her eyes widened in confusion. He looked at her, then nodded slightly. Nothing more. No probing. No celebration. He just accepted it. Over time, she moved with more ease. The limp never left completely, but her steps had rhythm again. She learned to handle tools, to seal minor breaches in the outer wall, to recognize which snowdrifts held sharp ice underneath, and which were soft enough to walk across. He never told her what to do. He showed her once, then let her decide. And she always chose to help. Their silence grew comfortable. It wasn't emptiness, it was understanding. They didn't fill the space with noise unless they had something worth saying. Some days passed with barely a dozen words. Still, the connection between them deepened, rooted in shared solitude. She learned he was once a soldier, though he never said the name of the war. His hands carried the memory, burned scars down one forearm, a finger that didn't bend fully, a faded tattoo from a long-dead unit. His eyes told more. Loss clung to him like smoke, but he never let it choke her. He kept it at bay, behind quiet routines and the simple dignity of living. One evening, she saw him sitting outside, watching the stars. She joined him without a word, arms wrapped in the patched coat he'd given her. After a while, he said, "I used to think space was infinite. But it's not. Not when you're carrying graves with you." She understood that weight. She carried her own. But here, in this small cabin on the edge of nowhere, those graves didn't press so hard. They sat beside her instead of on top of her. Memories still hurt, but they didn't cut as deep. When he fell sick, it was sudden. A fever that burned too hot, too fast. He tried to hide it, brushing off the shakes as fatigue. But his body betrayed him. Within hours, he was delirious, whispering names she didn't know, reaching for people long gone. She didn't panic. She gathered herbs from the nearby ridge, crushed the right ones into paste. She filtered snow for clean water. She stayed at his side through the night, cooling his skin with damp cloths, forcing sips of broth between his lips. Every hour she checked his pulse. Every hour she whispered words from a language she barely remembered, words of comfort, of protection. He survived. Barely. When he finally woke, his eyes found hers, and for the first time, she saw fear in them, not for himself, but for her. He reached for her hand, weak fingers barely curling. "You didn't leave," he murmured. She held his hand tighter. "I remembered how." That was all she said. His recovery was slow, but he regained strength. She cooked now, not just reheated. She adjusted the solar panels for maximum efficiency. She fixed the old scanner's antenna when it stuttered. He watched her, pride subtle in his expression. They began to share stories, just pieces. He spoke of Earth, the oceans, a dog he once had named Murphy. She told him about the twin moons of her birth world, the violet fields that shimmered like waves when the wind passed. He asked questions gently, never digging. She answered when she could. Sometimes she cried. Not loud. Not messy. Just quiet tears during late nights, her face turned away from the fire. He never tried to stop her. He simply made sure the kettle was full and the cabin was warm. They were not master and slave. Not man and alien. Not savior and saved. They were survivors. One morning, a message crackled through the old comms system, a patrol unit broadcasting standard calls for trade. His face hardened. He hadn't spoken with anyone off-world in years. She watched him carefully. "Do you want them to come?" she asked. "No," he said simply. "Not yet." But the message repeated every 12 hours. Eventually, he responded, not with coordinates, but with a redirect message. No distress. No contact. Just silence returned to silence. He didn't ask her why she looked relieved. She didn't ask him why he hadn't told them she was here. Trust didn't need to be announced. It lived in the choices they made. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he turned to her and said, "If you ever want to go back, to your world, or somewhere new, I'll help you." She didn't answer right away. Then, "I don't know where I belong yet." "That's okay," he replied. "We'll figure it out." That night, she added another blanket to his cot. Quiet thanks. She didn't dream of chains anymore. Not often. And when she did, she woke not with terror, but with the sure knowledge that no one here would lock her up again. In the stillness of their shared exile, something was growing, slow, careful, unspoken. But real. Strong. It had no name yet. It didn't need one. He had never imagined he'd fear the sound of engines again. Not after all the years spent in combat, in orbit, in silence broken only by the familiar hum of human-made machines. But the ship that appeared in the sky one morning wasn't human. The signature was wrong, too smooth, too quiet, almost like the ship didn't disturb the air it moved through. He knew that design. And she did too. She went still the moment the comms picked up the encrypted pulse. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from recognition. She knew that signal the way soldiers knew the click of a trigger. He decoded it in silence. It wasn't just a patrol or a stray merchant, it was a search beacon. A tracking signal set loose by the syndicate. They'd found her. There was no panic between them, only urgency. Words were few, actions sharp. He buried her old collar beneath the snow, deep enough that no scanner would find its chipped core. She disabled the cabin's power signature, blacking them out completely. He stashed the emergency rations, packed what little they might need if they had to run. She asked him once softly if he'd give her up. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he showed her the weapon case, the old rifle, the sidearm he hadn't touched in years. He cleaned them methodically, checked the charge, adjusted the sights. Then he handed her a shock blade from a hidden drawer, the kind used for close combat. She took it without hesitation. The syndicate ship didn't land right away. It hovered for hours, scanning, probing, calculating. They were watching the terrain, mapping routes, measuring heat differentials. They'd find the cabin. Not immediately, but eventually. And they wouldn't come to talk. The syndicate didn't negotiate for escaped property. It retrieved or eradicated. That night, they didn't sleep. They sat by the fireless hearth, listening. She told him what the syndicate did to those they caught. How they reconditioned minds. How they punished independence. How they destroyed anyone who had helped their property become contaminated with hope. He asked one thing. Do they know you're still alive? She hesitated. I don't know. If the syndicate knew, they'd want silence more than retrieval. No survivor could be allowed to speak of the camps, the experiments, the auctions. One alien slave with memories was a liability. Two people who had witnessed each other's healing, unacceptable. He told her then that he'd never let them take her back. Not alive. And not him either. She didn't protest. But she didn't accept it either. The next day, he left to scout the ridgeline while she set up countermeasures around the perimeter, thermal decoys, movement scatter signals. He returned with a simple truth. The ship had sent down a drone. Not for retrieval. For execution. This was not a rescue attempt. This was a cleanup. The drone was standard syndicate tech, armed with particle repeaters and drone swarm AI for mid-range suppression. One unit, but enough to level the cabin and anyone inside it. He did not suggest running. She did not suggest hiding. Instead, they set the traps. Old tricks he remembered from urban combat. Trip ignition fields, reflective traps to confuse targeting systems, flares that could burn through even enhanced optic sensors. She added her own, chemical snares, acidic foam deployed through compressed canisters, a native poison that caused short-term paralysis. They didn't expect to win. They only needed to delay long enough for the syndicate to assume their target had been neutralized. Sometimes, if a search and kill went silent for long enough, the mission was marked. Success assumed. The syndicate rarely wasted resources checking a kill twice. When the drone finally descended, it came without noise, without warning, just a shimmer across the horizon. She didn't flinch. He didn't breathe. The battle didn't last long. Less than 7 minutes. But it cost them everything. The cabin was lost, engulfed in flames by a malfunctioned decoy. The solar grid shattered. His arm was shredded by drone fire, and she took a direct hit to her side. But the drone never reported back. It was torn apart by the combined traps and her final ambush, struck from beneath the snow with her blade driven deep into its sensor core. She collapsed afterward, half-conscious from blood loss and pain. He carried her through the storm that followed, found shelter in a collapsed mining tunnel long abandoned. For 2 days they didn't speak. He cauterized her wound with fire and snow. She drifted between sleep and agony. On the 3rd day, she opened her eyes and whispered, "Did we survive?" He looked down at her, pale, burning with fever, still breathing. "We did," he said. "And they didn't." That mattered more than anything. They couldn't go back to the cabin. The syndicate might send another drone. But they knew now, resistance was possible. Survival wasn't guaranteed, but neither was capture. They had each other. They had the fire inside that refused to go out. He asked her, while she recovered, what she wanted next. Not what he should do, what she wanted. She told him she wanted to keep moving. Not run. Not hide. Move. Find a world where the syndicate's name meant nothing. Build something that couldn't be taken. He agreed. He dismantled the remaining weaponry, packed only what they could carry. She held the shock blade like it was part of her arm now. The fever broke, and her limp returned, but she walked upright. They left the mountain behind and didn't look back. Together, they vanished into the stars. Neither slave nor soldier anymore. Just two souls unchained, daring to write a future the galaxy never intended for them. Word spread quietly across the fringe worlds, of a man and a former slave, vanishing and reappearing from system to system, never staying long, but always leaving behind traces. They weren't fugitives in the usual sense. No one had seen them commit crimes. But the right eyes knew what they were. To the syndicate, they were living threats. To others, those still in chains, or hiding from old masters, they were something more. They began to attract whispers. Some said the man was former Terran Special Forces, now rogue. Others claimed the girl was a prototype slave meant for syndicate leadership, and she had turned against her creators. It didn't matter what the truth was. The effect remained. Their story bred hope. On a mining station above the gas world Uralan, a group of alien workers fought back against their overseers, citing what they called the 15-credit rebellion, a nod to the rumored price the human had paid. On the frozen moons of Delta Cyros, drones loyal to the syndicate vanished, their parts later found melted, sliced, or rendered inert. The pattern suggested skilled sabotage. The syndicate blamed rebels. Others believed it was them, ghosts working in silence. They never took credit. They never needed to. The girl, once weak, once broken, became decisive, sharp, a strategist. Her pain hadn't faded, but it had been redirected. The man had stopped treating her as someone to protect. He treated her as an equal, and that made her dangerous. Not because of what she had endured, but because of what she had learned to become. The galaxy wasn't ready for someone like her. She spoke languages the syndicate kept secret. She remembered codes buried deep in transport algorithms. She exposed weak links in tracking systems that the human alone would have missed. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a key, one that unlocked doors others didn't even know were there. They dismantled trafficking lines not with armies, but with precision. A hack signal, a shut port, an airlock left open just long enough for a cargo ship full of slaves to escape. Over time, they formed loose ties with other humans, freelancers, mercenaries, former Marines, blacklisted pilots. Not allies. Not yet. But nodes in a web, each of them capable of responding if the call came. The syndicate started to bleed. On the planet Varus, an underground slave auction was ambushed. The guards were unconscious before the first bid. Surveillance footage showed nothing but static. All assets vanished. The syndicate suspected human interference, but couldn't trace it. Their logs showed a low-income freight hauler registered to a retired soldier, decommissioned, flagged, and previously assumed dead. That soldier had a passenger. She used no name. She let her actions speak. The galaxy responded. A former slaver surrendered to planetary authorities after seeing a viral transmission of freed captives escaping into the forests of Marin Theta. The signal carried a distinct voice message. Your value is not your price tag. It was the first time anyone outside the underground heard her voice. She became a symbol. The United Systems Coalition, once neutral on syndicate trade practices, opened an inquiry. On the record, nothing changed. Behind the scenes, agents began investigating back channels. Some offered assistance in exchange for intelligence. Others wanted only to watch, waiting to see if a pattern emerged. The pattern was undeniable. Each system they touched saw a shift. Not always overt, but measurable. Slave markets grew cautious. Traders rerouted. Patrols doubled. The syndicate paid attention. They deployed cleaner teams, elite hunters trained to disappear troublemakers without fanfare. 2 were sent. Neither returned. The man was a tactician. She was the insurgent. Together, they were chaos. The kind the syndicate had never truly feared until now. And yet others sought fame. They slept in cold ships. Ate in dim-lit hangars. Lived off barter, trade, and salvage tech. They stayed invisible not out of fear, but because their purpose wasn't conquest. It was disruption. A slow unraveling of the system that had created her chains. Every time she saw another enslaved creature, bound, tracked, silenced, her expression hardened. She never spoke about her past anymore. She didn't need to. Everyone who looked into her eyes knew exactly what had been taken from her, and why she would never allow it to happen again. He, once the silent guardian, now followed her lead more often than not. She had grown into something greater than either of them had expected. She knew pain intimately, but had turned it into precision. Not vengeance. Precision. Every operation, every decision, was calculated, clean, efficient. No waste. No excess. No gloating. They didn't kill unless they had to. But when they did, it was final. Rumors claimed they'd destroyed entire fleets. That wasn't true. What they did destroy was the illusion. The myth that the syndicate was untouchable. That its property stayed broken. That one life, bought cheaply, could never spark anything more. Because she had sparked something. People began to rise, not because they thought they could win, but because someone had shown them how to resist. The price of 15 credits had become the symbol of defiance. She never called herself a leader, but others did. The man never claimed heroism, but others remembered. In markets, on outer worlds, in the graffiti under spaceports, the phrase began to appear. She was not bought. She was freed. And beneath it, a symbol, a broken chain turned into a blade. The syndicate no longer dismissed them as rogue elements. They assigned them a classification. Category Red, uplifted threats. The message was clear. These weren't slaves. These weren't enemies. These were vectors, of change, of danger, of revolution. But they didn't slow down. They didn't stop. They knew the syndicate would send more. But they also knew the syndicate was bleeding time, money, reputation. And every world that joined their cause, every life unchained, made the syndicate's grip weaker. She remembered what it was to kneel. And she remembered what it felt like to stand. And now, nothing, not ships, not money, not pain, could make her fall again. The operation on Enlor Prime was supposed to be their last. Not because they had tired, but because the scale of the mission risked everything they had built. 100 captives, 3 syndicate transports, and 2 secure vaults containing black records, proof of syndicate dealings with members of the coalition itself. If the data could be extracted, if the prisoners could be saved, they would expose rot from top to bottom. But the mission went sideways fast. Surveillance layers were denser than predicted. Backup guards arrived early. And the moment the vault was breached, the silent alarm triggered. He told her to run. For the first time since they'd escaped that pit of a slave auction, he sounded uncertain. Not afraid, just aware. Aware that this might be the end of the line for him. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't freeze. She looked him in the eye, nodded, and vanished into the smoke and fire of the conflict they'd helped ignite. She didn't want to leave him. But she understood why he made the choice. He had always treated her like a person. Now, for the first time, she had to act like one without him. When she resurfaced 3 weeks later, it was through pirate comms. Grainy footage. She walked out of a syndicate facility carrying the man's dog tags, covered in ash. No footage showed how she got out, or what she did inside. But 3 hours after that feed went live, the syndicate base was vaporized by a rogue orbital strike from a drone ship long thought lost. No one claimed responsibility. No one had to. After that, the tone changed. Before, she was a whisper. Now, she was a symbol. Not just of freedom, but of wrath. Calm, cold, and targeted. Where he had once given her hope, now she gave others purpose. Their story had reached its turning point. He had been the catalyst. But she was the continuation. Coalition senators started pushing formal legislation to limit trade relationships with syndicate-linked sectors. Civilian uprisings in 3 mid-tier systems coordinated attacks on outposts and slaver docks. On Vexal, an enslaved race of engineers revolted using modified maintenance bots as weapons. Their chant, played across all frequencies, included her name. She didn't return to the old hideouts. Didn't contact old allies. She changed ships. Changed hair. Changed voices. But the mission didn't stop. The cargo she freed was no longer just flesh, it was data, leverage, secrets the syndicate had buried for decades. She leaked nothing publicly. She simply delivered it to the right people. Whistleblowers. Investigators. Journalists who had waited for a single crack to split the surface. The syndicate was breaking. Quietly, not with a bang, but with the slow fracturing of control. Traders grew paranoid. Routes became too risky. Insurance prices spiked. Rebellions began to resemble revolutions. But she kept moving forward. Always focused. Never flashy. Until the last job. It wasn't even meant to be significant. A low-tier auction on a forgotten moon. Just another extraction. But among the captives was a girl, maybe 10 years old, with eyes too old for her face. She didn't cry. Didn't scream. Just stared at the guards with the same empty defiance once seen in another face years ago. She paused. For the first time in what felt like years, she hesitated. The girl didn't speak English. Didn't need to. She reached out and touched the chain on her own wrist, then tapped her chest twice. The same gesture the human had used all those years ago. That simple rhythm. A heartbeat. A promise. You are not your pain. She freed them all. But she sat with the girl last. Tied the chain into a knot and left it there on the auction platform, melted into the steel. Not as a weapon. As a marker. A grave for every identity they'd been forced to abandon. For every memory scraped raw by the sound of collars locking shut. After that, she stopped being a ghost. She began recording. Not for the public. Not for the media. But for those who had followed in silence. She told the story. Not just hers. The man's too. The one who had given her his rations when she could barely speak. The one who taught her to fly, to think, to breathe again. He hadn't saved her. He'd simply refused to treat her like property. And that had been enough. She didn't cry when she spoke about him. But the silence between her words carried more weight than grief. It carried understanding. She wasn't broken by his absence. She was defined by what his presence had allowed her to become. She closed the recording with the same words he'd said when she first asked why he bought her. Because no one else did. The message reached corners of the galaxy that no blaster or starship ever could. Because it wasn't just about pain or rebellion anymore. It was about responsibility. The quiet power of choice. The idea that doing the right thing didn't require glory, didn't demand perfection, only that someone act when others stayed silent. The girl from the auction survived. Years later, she too became a name on the networks. A rescuer. A rebel. A woman with eyes full of ancient storms and fire. And when they asked her who taught her, she didn't say a name. She pointed to the stars. The story didn't end with the man. Or with the girl he freed. It multiplied. Because trauma doesn't vanish. But it can evolve. It can be passed forward, not as suffering, but as power. They never found her body. Some say she died in a syndicate ambush. Others claim she lives under another name, freeing captives one by one. Maybe she's gone. Maybe she's watching. But everywhere chains rattle now, someone listens. And in those moments, a heartbeat echoes. Not just hers. Ours.